Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be my TBR of sorts for Nonfiction November, which is really going to be in the form of mostly a library haul with a handful of owned books. Nonfiction November, of course, is the brainchild of Olive from A Book Olive. I will link to her official announcement video below. As somebody who mostly reads nonfiction, this is one of my favorite bits of booktube every year. Normally I would have recorded this a couple of weeks ago, but I did lose my voice. So if I sound slightly odd, that's why. I'm still getting over that. But whatever, better late than never. If we're connected on Instagram, you may have seen some of these already. So, books I have out of the library. First up, I have How Artists Work, Daily Rituals. This is edited by Mason Currey, who started this project as a blog, and it became this book. This is an overview of, not an overview, this is 200 pages of some summaries, some more detailed, of the daily schedules of a variety of creative people. Basically everyone from Benjamin Franklin to Stephen King. If you have ever watched those YouTube videos where various self-help, usually, YouTubers say, I'm following Maya Angelou's or Benjamin Franklin's or whoever's schedule for the day, they probably got it from a book like this, because that's what this goes through. I have read this already. This was my first. I just finished that the other day. It is what it says on the tin. It's interesting. I'm nosy, so I like seeing stuff about people's lives. But is it deep, and is there an evaluation of how successful everyone's schedule is? No, it's just a look at different people's schedules. Next up, I have Like Eating a Stone by Wojciech Tochman. The subheading on this one is Surviving the Past in Bosnia. This is a short book that is basically this Polish journalist traveling through Bosnia and talking to survivors of the war in the 90s and talking to them about how one deals with living in the aftermath of that. If you follow current politics in Bosnia, you will notice that there is some dramatic political stuff going on right now, so I think it's worth thinking about what has happened there while evaluating what's happening now. So it should be interesting. If you've seen some of my recent videos, you'll know I've been reading quite a few works from not just Bosnia, but other former Yugoslav countries, so we tie into that with more of an outsider lens on that one. Next up, I have Lemn Sissay's My Name is Why, which is part memoir and part, I think, a critique of the care system in the United Kingdom. He is a university administrator, but also writer and poet, and went into the care system as a very young child, had his name changed, hence the title, because his mother was Ethiopian, and he was given an English name when he went into care and didn't find out until he was 17 that his mother had actually been looking to reunite and that he had a different real name and whatnot. Most of the reviews I have seen of this have been fantastic, so I'm curious to read it myself. I have seen the author interviewed about both the book and also about critiques of the care system in the UK, so I think that should be interesting. Next up, I have another memoir. This is Don't Forget Us Here, Lost and Found at Guantánamo by Mansoor Adayfi, who was originally from Yemen and at 18 had traveled to Afghanistan, where he was kidnapped by warlords who then sold him to the United States, who then locked him up for 14 years. And that is what this is about. There have been a couple of other memoirs by people who were in similar situations, but I think there's value to looking at as many of them as possible. This was newly released, so I haven't seen a huge number of people talking about that yet because it is a new release, but so far what I've heard has been interesting. So next up, I have Kamal Al-Solaylee's Return, Why We Go Back Where We Came From. Kamal Al-Solaylee is a lecturer at Ryerson University here in Toronto. If you're from Toronto, you may remember him back in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was a critic and a music and arts theater critic in some of the newspapers here. His memoir, Intolerable, was interesting, was nominated for the, the Toronto Book Award a number of years ago. He is another writer that I saw speaking at the Eden Mills Writers Festival, which I mentioned a while ago when I had read another author who was on the same panel. When I read his memoir, I was surprised by how different in tone it felt from his theater criticism that I'd read, ages ago. So I'm curious to see what that's like, because that will be because that obviously is going to be less intimate, I imagine. And it focuses on people who have either chosen to or chosen not to return after having been immigrants or expats or refugees or whatnot, and what the thinking is behind returning or not, which is always something that I think is interesting, because everyone's thoughts about what is home is differ, and I have known quite a few people who think they're going to go back somewhere and realize that the going back that they wanted to go back to doesn't exist anymore, which I think is more common than a lot of people who aren't in that situation appreciate. Anyway, should be interesting. Next up is a book that half of BookTube, I think, have talked about. This is Michelle Zauner's Crying in the H-Mart, a memoir, which I believe is about the author being in her 20s, having her mother die, and what that means when your parent is your connection to a particular cultural entry point and whatnot. Anyway, everything I've heard about this has been glowing, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it because I think everybody and their brother has read that already. Next up, I have Jessica J. Lee's Turning, A Year in the Water. Jessica J. Lee is the author of Two Trees Make a Forest, which is part family memoir and part nature writing about Taiwan. I talked about that a few weeks ago. This is an earlier book that she had written that is essentially a meditation on swimming in lakes and being part of the outside and just swimming in winter outside as well, which a lot of people talk about, but usually through the framework of like the Wim Hof method. And this, I believe, is more about swimming and not breathing. So not that she's not breathing, but you know what I mean, if you know about the Wim Hof, if you're familiar with how a lot of that cold water swimming goes. Next up, I have Life in the City of Dirty Water by Clayton Thomas-Müller, which I believe is in part a general memoir and in part a critique of the residential school systems in Canada and also environmental destruction in Indigenous areas, which means that this would be also on topic for the Indigathon, which is also happening this month. And I believe he is also Cree from northern Manitoba, which ties into Northern Lights, which I talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is also about environmental issues in northern Manitoba. Next up, I have Because Internet, Understanding the New Rules of Language by Gretchen McCulloch. I heard about this from Shannon from That's So Po, and I will link to her review of this below. The author of this is a linguist, and this is a linguistics perspective as opposed to a pop culture perspective, I believe, on the way language is used online. Again, this is a book I've heard mostly good things about, so I look forward to getting to that. And that, I believe, is mostly the end of the library stack, at least that I can get to without causing a landslide. I do have a few owned books that I might be reading this month too, so I'll throw those in. First up, I have a book that I posted on the community tab the other day that I had started reading this. This is Colors of the Cage, a prison memoir by Arun Ferreira, who is a very left-wing political activist in India who spent just under 5 years in prison without actually being convicted of anything. And this is a memoir of his experience there. I'm about not quite a quarter of the way into this. And it's interesting, there isn't actually a lot of political commentary in this. It is a very straightforward memoir, but that is still interesting because I haven't read any Indian political prisoner memoirs, so. But while we're on the topic of political prisoner memoirs, I was also thinking about reading Ahmet Altan's I Will Never See the World Again, who was a political prisoner in Turkey. When he wrote this, he was serving a life sentence. He has actually been released since then because he was imprisoned after the 2016 coup. And I anticipate this being interesting. It has very large print, so I think it's going to be shorter than some of the other stuff I've looked at because, you know, we can always get more depressing. I have another sort of prison memoir, and this is Rezak Hukanovic's The 10th Circle of Hell, which is a memoir of having been in one of the ethnic cleansing camps that are what we talk about when you talk about war crimes. One of the things we talk about when we talk about war crimes that happened in Bosnia in the 90s. So this should be interesting. This is actually not in print. I found this secondhand, and it is difficult to find. Yeah, and that was translated by Emil Alcalay, whose translations and actually whose own work I've read a bit of this year too, who is just fantastic, whose philosophy around translation as activism I really like. So I think I'm almost interested as much in reading it for the translation as for anything else. So you can never have too many war memoirs. I also have Baghdad Diaries by Nuha El-Radi, and this is a memoir of, I believe, the first Gulf War in Baghdad. And also a disproportionate number of the war memoirs I've read are by men, so, and this is, the subheading on here is A Woman's Chronicle of War. So how about something that's not about political prisoners or war? I know this will be shocking. I also have Orphan Comics' The Innocence of Objects, which is the book that he wrote to tie into his museum that he opened that ties into his novel, Museum of Innocence. Museum of Innocence is one of those books that it's kind of gross because it's about a really creepy sexual obsession. But the further you get away from the book, the more you think about it in terms of how it's a portrait of items, which is clearly what he wrote, what the museum is. And this, I believe, looks through the items. And I mean, the item thing is what sticks with you, because when I read that book years ago and I was mostly talking about, this is gross. But as you go on, the parts that has stayed with me more is the main character's relationship to his car, which is exactly like my uncle. One of my uncles, my mother's youngest brother, who is exactly the same age as that character, has the same car and has the same relationship to his car. So the whole stuff element does carry through more than the gross main plot. I don't know if that made sense, but anyway, I think that'll be interesting. I was going to say that would be all, but that's not true, because I also have Margaret MacMillan's War, How Conflict Shaped Us, which my sister gave me this as a New Year's gift last year, so I should read it by the end of this year, hopefully. Margaret MacMillan has written a number of works of military history and social history social histories that are tied to military history, so I think this will be an interesting, more general look at that, because most of the ones that she's written before are specifically about periods like this is 1919 or something like that. So that should be, I almost said that should be fun, probably not fun. In any case, this is my potential TBR for Nonfiction November. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear what you thought, whether they were good or bad or meh. I'd be curious. Are you taking part in Nonfiction November? Will you be reading prison or war memoirs? Or are you reading something a little lighter, like self-help? Because that is essentially what that first book was, so hey, this isn't all depressing stuff for once. Yeah. In any case, that's it for now. Ciao.